Hello! Today we will deal with everything you need to know about chargebacks and the representment process. This refers to the customer's demand for a chargeback and the steps taken to demonstrate that a transaction was legitimate. While chargebacks can pose significant costs and risks for online businesses, the positive aspect is that they can be handled successfully. Let's talk about chargebacks or refunds. A chargeback represents a protective measure provided by banks to their clients, allowing them to dispute transactions listed on their statements. Typical reasons for chargebacks include credits that were not processed, items that were never received, technical problems, card malfunctions, and more. It is important to note that chargebacks also incur costs for the merchant, not to mention the time and energy that merchants invest. An excessive number of chargebacks can raise the chargeback ratio, potentially leading to greater financial penalties for the merchant. Chargebacks can sometimes be scams, and fraudulent chargebacks are not easy for the merchant to fend off, even if the merchant presents all relevant documents and evidence. In light of these circumstances, it is essential to take all necessary actions to avert chargebacks. Sometimes they are simply unavoidable. This is where the chargeback or representation process comes into play. Here's how it works. The process starts when a product or service is paid for and the customer chooses to reach out to the issuing bank to initiate a chargeback. This chargeback request is sent to both the card organization and the acquirer. At this point in the process, the merchant must pay a chargeback fee. The fee varies based on the contract. Once the chargeback request has been submitted, the merchant sends all relevant documents, receipts, shipping proofs, logs, signatures, etc. to the acquirer using the payment gateway, in this case, Shift4. All documents are collected in the so-called chargeback representation form. As soon as the form is submitted to the acquirer, it is forwarded to the issuer for a final decision. What if the merchant wins, but the customer is still not satisfied? Well, if the merchant provides sufficient documentation and wins the final decision on the chargeback, the customer can still choose to initiate a pre-arbitration process. Sadly, this results in extra expenses for the merchant. The value also relies on the contract details and conditions. Still, the pre-arbitration process is not the final option. If the decision is still unsatisfactory for either party, including the merchant, both can request a final arbitration process. Similar to the pre-arbitration, this phase results in a greater penalty for the losing party. Therefore, the merchant needs to be ready to accept this risk. Now that we have clarified what chargebacks are and how the representation process works, let's talk about soft chargebacks, also known as soft recovery requests. These can occur, for example, when the customer simply does not remember the transaction, or if the transaction was carried out by a family member who used the card data without the cardholder's knowledge. In either scenario, the customer might find an unexpected charge on their account. He asks for transaction details instead of disputing the charge. Responding swiftly to inquiries is an effective strategy for merchants to prevent chargebacks. And with Shift4, answering these inquiries is very easy as we provide all the necessary forms. Let's talk about double refunds. These are disadvantageous for merchants as they end up paying twice. Here is an example. A customer buys something from a merchant site. Moments later, the merchant receives a notification of a high likelihood of fraud. So he decides to refund the transactions. When he does this, the money is refunded to the customer, but the customer still proceeds with filing a chargeback request. At this point, the chargeback and representation process begins, and the merchant is responsible for the fees associated with the process. Luckily, these transactions are generally fraudulent cases, meaning that the merchant often comes out on top in most situations. It is crucial to understand that chargebacks continue to affect the chargeback rate, and the time and costs related to the chargeback and representation process remain relevant. So how can merchants combat chargebacks? While it is impossible to completely avoid chargebacks, there are several ways to reduce them. In addition to a clear and concise product description, shipping details, and return policies for customers, it is important for merchants to secure their websites. Implementing a separate procedure for distinct authorization and payment capture via Shift4 is an excellent initial measure. We have created a separate video for this, which I will link below. Moreover, 3D Secure is a great method to transfer liability from the acquirer to the issuing bank. The issuer is then responsible for covering the costs and assuming the risk and liability. Thanks for watching. More info is available on our website.